So, at the end of the previous episode, our heroes made it back to the TARDIS, escaping the cavemen, and left to go get themselves cleaned up, completely failing to notice that the radiation meter in the TARDIS was going off, signaling a danger level in the new location they've arrived at. Thus ends the first serial of Doctor Who. Now we launch into the second serial, which has one of my favorite opening episodes ever. In this episode, The Dead Planet, they leave the TARDIS and explore what they find to be a petrified forest around them, which they're all fascinated by. Susan finds a beautiful preserved flower, although that gets broken when Barbara finds a dead metallic creature. But everything appears to be dead. And just as they're ready to leave, Susan discovers a technologically advanced city in the distance, which the Doctor wants to explore, but everyone else doesn't. Reluctantly, he heads back. On their trip back to the TARDIS, Susan is followed through the forest by something which touches her on the shoulder, frightening her a lot, although the Doctor does not believe her once they reach the TARDIS again. Although Susan's story is confirmed when there's a tapping on the outside of the TARDIS that they all hear. Everyone wants to leave this planet except for the Doctor, who's insistent on checking out the city and seeing what there is. When it becomes clear to him that he's outnumbered, instead of arguing some more, he chooses to sabotage a bit of the ship, the fluid link, to make it look as though it doesn't work, and then claims that they need to fill it with mercury in order for the ship to be functional again. And of course, the only place where mercury might be found on this planet is in the city. They set out to explore the city. As they leave the TARDIS, they encounter a box of glass vials outside the TARDIS that they don't understand. They leave it in the TARDIS and head to the city. By the time they reach there, they're all feeling very tired and exhausted, and they split up to find mercury. The other three make it back okay, but Barbara is essentially maneuvered throughout the city via cameras and closing doors and lifts or elevators if you're from my country, before she is eventually confronted by something we don't entirely see with a plunger for a hand. Where to start? This is arguably the most important serial in all of Doctor Who. It's the reason there's a Doctor Who today. And we'll go a bit into why when we get to the second episode. And to be fair, there are other candidates for most important serial, but I feel this one has a strong case to be made for it. It's also our first alien planet. This is the show living up to the space part of time and space. Going to other worlds is pretty commonplace for Doctor Who in later eras, but this was the first time. This was an event. I also find it interesting that there's a continuous narrative between the previous serial and this one. That radiation meter cliffhanger bridges the gap between the two serials. I feel like this continuous narrative works very well for early Doctor Who. It gives us the feeling that we are learning about the Doctor's world or worlds at the same rate that Ian and Barbara are. It's not something they could sustain forever. Eventually the serials will become much more discrete, and the gaps between them will get filled by books, audios, comics, sometimes to the point of ridiculousness. But at this point, it's still one continuous narrative. Still, even within the continuous narrative, this is clearly the beginning of a new section of the story. And there are different approaches to how to start a story, both in general and in Doctor Who in particular. The new series of Doctor Who tends to introduce concepts very, very quickly. It kind of has to. Most of its stories are standalone episodes, but Classic Who had more time to introduce concepts. Some Doctor Who stories introduce things from the point of view of people from the time and place that the TARDIS is visiting. The first story did this because Ian and Barbara were from London 1963. And then even when they shift to the caveman portion of the serial, we briefly shifted to the cavemen's point of view before things became more integrated. This story takes the opposite approach. We learn things as the inhabitants of the TARDIS do. We see everything from the point of view of Ian, Susan, Barbara, and the Doctor. We don't learn anything that they don't. Although we do shift perspective between the four of them, so we get a slightly more rounded view of the situation than any one of them has. For instance, we know that Susan is right about the hand that reached out and touched her shoulder in the forest, even though the Doctor doesn't believe her. We know the Doctor has faked the fluid link problem, even though the other three don't. And we can see that Barbara is being stalked through the city while the other three are unaware of her situation and are worried. I have always had a fondness for this approach, this sort of TARDIS crew's eye view of things, one in which you explore as they explore. It's not a sustainable approach. You can't keep it going throughout the entire serial. Eventually, we need to learn the context that explains the various things that they're encountering. But I do think it's a very effective way to start the story. It is also an approach that the serial's writer, Terry Nation, tends to use a lot. Let's talk a little bit about Terry Nation. Terry Nation wrote this serial, and in doing so, probably cemented Doctor Who's future. But honestly, I think Terry Nation tends to get a bit of a bad rap amongst Doctor Who fans. Part of this is that he repeats his themes and tropes a lot. And yes, that's true, he does. Terry likes his deserted, foreboding locations. He likes his mysterious figures observing the main characters, ones that originally seem to be like a threat but usually turn out to be an ally. He likes to have them emerge from something at the end of the first episode. He likes his ruthless fascist villains, his mutants, his germ warfare, his radiation. He also loves invisible monsters and characters named Tarrant, although those two won't show up in this particular story. But tropes and themes can continue to be effective regardless of how many times they're used, especially if there's distance between them and it's not like Terry Nation stories come back to back. When I watch the first episode of a serial written by Terry Nation, I am immediately invested in what's going on, and I think that's something to be appreciated. Further, Terry sometimes flips his tropes around a little bit. For instance, in Blake 7, another series, he does the mysterious stranger trope that I was talking about, but in this one, the stranger initially seems to be a threat, turns out to be an ally, and then it gets flipped again, and he turns out to actually be a threat after all. But flipped or not, the tropes that Terry uses make his world feel dangerous. His stories have a feeling of grimness and fear that pervades everything. Nation was clearly influenced by Britain's World War II history and by Cold War Soviet Union imagery. The result of this is that Nation's version of Doctor Who's universe is one that is not safe, but is filled with danger and potential death. This sensibility pervades his other work too, like Blake 7 and Survivors. It is a somewhat cynical approach, and it's not a theme and a mood that I'd want Doctor Who to dwell in consistently, but I do think it's worth periodically revisiting it, and Terry Nation does that. Apart from establishing some of his tropes, Nation also gets the chance to define the main characters because this is such an early serial. For instance, Terry introduces the Doctor's sheer level of curiosity in this episode, which is one of the Doctor's most defining traits. Arguably, it is his most defining trait, one that's stronger even than his desire for safety for himself and Susan. The Doctor wants to see, he wants to know, he wants to experience that which he doesn't yet understand. And he'll continue to do so for the next 6 decades or so. This curiosity is best exemplified in this episode by the trick he pulls with the fluid link with the TARDIS. His curiosity overrides his need for security. And further, he doesn't just make that decision for himself, he tricks everyone and thus makes it for all of them. Now, in a wider sense, this is a choice the show needed to make in order for the series to work. If security trumped curiosity, there would be no show. If the TARDIS crew decides to leave at the first hint of danger, they never get involved in anything. But both the creators and the audience want more than that. We don't want to just see little brief glimpses of the world they visit. We want to see our characters get involved in things. We want to see them swept up in events. We want to see them affect things and be affected by things. We want them to be more than just observers. Like the Doctor, we want the non-interference directive broken. We want to see them have an impact on the events. So it was kind of inevitable that the Doctor's sense of curiosity would win out over his sense of security in order to make the story function. That's why it had to happen in order for the story to work, but why does it happen in the story? Well, part of it's the Doctor's curiosity itself. It's very strong. He has an insatiable desire to see things and experience things and know what's going on. He wants to expand his knowledge. It's worth noting that he is ready to leave right before Susan discovers the city, and then suddenly he's got a whole new thing to explore. It's filled with technology and insights into culture. He no longer thinks he knows everything about the planet. I also think part of why he wants to go there is because everyone else doesn't. That is definitely a motivation for the Doctor in these early days. Ian and Barbara don't want to go there, and despite the fact that the Doctor is responsible for Ian and Barbara even being in this position in the first place, he doesn't want them to have any say over his decision-making process. The Doctor spent most of the last serial arguing with Ian about who was in charge, and that argument is still going on. Indeed, without Ian and Barbara there, the Doctor assumes, probably correctly, that he could just convince Susan to go down with him. But they are there, and she takes their side, and he's not going to have that. He is not about to be the person with the least amount of decision-making power in the group. Now, if I want to be fair, the Doctor does seem to legitimately think there is no danger in going to the city. He believes the planet is dead. Yes, he heard the tapping on the outside of the TARDIS, but he has no reason to believe that's anything hostile. And I'd be willing to bet he's probably written it off as something non-sentient. Why do I think this? Because the Doctor's desire to keep himself and Susan safe was very prominent in the last episode, and it was so prominent that I find it hard to believe that he would entirely abandon it now. So, therefore, he sort of must think it's safe. He is, of course, wrong. What's interesting is his method of going about this. He doesn't convince them, and he doesn't nakedly insist on his authority. No, he tricks them. It's the same kind of trick he'll use on various antagonists later in the series. Indeed, you can still make the argument that the Doctor is the antagonist at this point in the story. He's certainly the one who gets them into trouble. He's also completely unapologetic about it once he gets his own way. He giggles and gloats about it once the trick worked. When Ian tries to insist that he remember that they're only looking for Mercury, he pretty much ignores him. Basically, he blows off Ian's attempt to assert any authority whatsoever. The Doctor's gotten what he wants, and he knows it. That said, the Doctor does have little moments of civility. There's a very nice little moment when he comments to Barbara about how the age gap between himself and Susan sometimes makes it difficult for there to be an understanding between them. It's probably the most vulnerable moment we've seen from the Doctor so far. Still, it's hard to argue with Barbara when she says she thinks he deserves to have something happen to him. Poor Barbara. Poor Barbara just wants to go home. And it's hard to blame her. Her adventure with the cavemen didn't really have an upside to it. It was nothing but terror and fear of death. Doctor Who fandom tends to favor the companions who are exceedingly brave, who react to danger with nothing but bravery and no fear. But the truth is, those are startlingly unrealistic reactions. The way Barbara reacts to everything is far more realistic. As I said, up until now, there's been no upside to her adventure. The fact that she just wants to go home is a pretty reasonable reaction to it. As she says, she's an unwilling adventurer. And there hasn't been anything that's happened yet to make her willing. I should point out that this is not incompatible with what I said a few episodes ago about Barbara being more accepting about what's going on. There's a difference between accepting that something's happening and being okay with it, between understanding that something strange is going on and adopting that into your permanent lifestyle. As she says, she'd invested a lot in the idea that they were just going to go home after that, and that hope has been dashed. Luckily, Ian's there to provide a bit of hope for Barbara. Ian's reacting to everything in a much more practical manner. He's looking at things in more of a short-term problem solver style than adjusting his long-term thinking. And he thinks that they can overcome anything as long as they rely on each other. Indeed, that's his whole issue with the Doctor, is that the Doctor isn't reliable, and he really isn't at this point. Nor do the events of this episode help in that regard. It's interesting. Ian has that bit where he tells Barbara to really believe that they'll get home. And to me, it feels like he's basically saying, I can handle the practical side of this as long as you keep up the hope for the both of us. He's not just asking her to hope for herself, but to hope for both of them. He needs her as much as she needs him. But it's the 60s and he's a guy, so he can't straight out say that. He has to act like he's just offering to help her. And he definitely still needs her help because he's still engaged in this struggle for leadership with the Doctor. Indeed, I think Ian thinks he's winning at this point. I think he especially thinks this after he gets the Doctor to back off from going to visit the city. But he's wrong. He's losing. The Doctor has changed the playing field of the contest. It is no longer a contest of wills. It's just a matter of results. He's no longer having a straight-up conflict with him. He's just cleverly tricking him. So Ian's lost without even really realizing it. Ian is the opposite of the Doctor. In the debate we were discussing before, security trumps curiosity for him. Now, as I mentioned, he's narratively destined to lose that particular struggle. He's not going to be able to convince them all to value security over curiosity, because if he did, there'd be no show. It's also worth noting that Ian does not lack curiosity. It's just not the strongest impulse he has. I think the best example of this is Susan's flower. He takes it, he helps her to preserve it, he makes a point of how delicate they need to treat it, and then as soon as Barbara screams, he runs off and accidentally crushes it in the process. Alas, poor Susan and her flower. She's really not destined to keep one of those things. Ian crushes the first one, she loses the second one when that thing stalks her through the forest. Even her attempt to later draw one in the TARDIS gets interrupted. Susan just generally has a rough time in this episode. There's the flower thing, there's the argument with her grandfather, there's the fact that she's stalked through the forest and then it takes a lot to get anybody to believe her. It's also interesting to note that in terms of wider motivation, Susan's approach to exploration is different than her grandfather's. He is curious about everything, regardless of whether it's good or bad. She is looking for the good and the beautiful. The Doctor is looking for any world. Susan is looking for a pleasant one. Susan doesn't hate this lifestyle, but between this, the fact that she was trying to stay in one place in 1963, and some other things that come up in later serials, it seems clear to me that while the Doctor is just looking to explore forever, Susan is looking for a place where she can belong. That's probably why she attended Coal Hill School. She was trying to figure out if this was that place, and she does seem to have enjoyed it. She does say those 5 months were the happiest of her life. Her grandfather, on the other hand, wants to wander forever. The Doctor is comfortable being the perpetual outsider, but Susan wants to belong somewhere. Susan also goes into hysterics again in this episode. Like the last episode, I understand these specific circumstances. She's being stalked through the forest. But I do wish this was a trait that they would have allowed Susan to grow out of. They do allow Barbara to grow out of it. I fail to see why Susan couldn't get that as well. On the other hand, Susan does attempt to assert herself against her grandfather's control a little bit in this episode. She insists on her story about what happened in the forest, despite his disbelief, and we saw the hand touch her. We know that this was the case. I mean, we know she's right. Even when she gives in later, this seems more about appeasing him than actually admitting that she was wrong. What she actually says is, "Grandfather, I'm sorry I was so silly just now." That's ending the fight, not telling him she was wrong. And she clearly feels validated when they hear that tapping on the outside of the ship that proves her right. Carol Ann Ford also does this great eye roll when Barbara mentions that her grandfather finds it hard to go against his scientific facts. She rolls her eyes and goes, "I know," which I think Carol Ann Ford acts very well, and it also makes clear that this is not the first time she and her grandfather have had an argument like this. She also sides with Ian and Barbara against going to the city, both initially when they find it and then later when they want to leave in the TARDIS. Indeed, I suspect that this is what actually prompts the Doctor to pull the trick with the fluid link at all. At this point, Ian and Barbara aren't just arguing with him, but they're turning his granddaughter against him, and as I said, he's not going to have that. This episode, The Dead Planet, also really sees the return of the feel of that atmosphere I was talking about in the very first episode. When I talked about that episode, I said that I was defining atmosphere in Doctor Who by that feeling that there's something hidden, something beyond the normal that you can't quite see. And it might seem odd to apply that to this episode, which is on an alien world with a petrified jungle and a metal creature and things stalking you through the forest with an alien city. But to me, the Dead Planet is just dripping with atmosphere. Part of this is that my definition I was talking about does not require the base level for normal to be the real world. It just requires that feeling that there's something beneath the surface, something we can't quite see, and the Dead Planet has that in spades. Further, because it's a Terry Nation story, that feeling is that whatever it is we can't see is actively hostile and dangerous. It's not just watching, it wants to hurt them. In the episode, even before we get to the visuals, Tristram Carey's incidental music establishes this feeling. It immediately sets everything up as a little bit off kilter. It's emphasizing the oddity of things. I particularly like the music while Susan is being stalked through the forest. Although I'll admit, visually I think it's a little clunky the way the hand reaches out and touches her shoulder. But the music is great. But their exploration of the forest is generally peaceful, but there is always the feeling that there is something just outside what they're seeing, something just outside their point of view. Susan is followed and grabbed. There's the tapping outside the TARDIS. There's the box of glass vials they find outside the TARDIS. There's the distinct feeling that they are being observed as they observe, and that what's observing them may not be friendly. And the characters seem very aware of this feeling as well, although they react to it in different ways. Barbara seems very on edge the whole time. She screams at the drop of a hat, especially when she sees that dead creature. And her immediate reaction to the city is that they're not going to go down there. Ian backs her up. As I said, Ian values security over curiosity. And he clearly shares that feeling that something isn't quite right. You only get that need for security to trump curiosity when there's something dangerous about. And Susan, of course, has an actual encounter with something. But I note that the fear starts to sort of grip her even before the thing reaches out and touches her. She's clearly already got the feeling that there's something out there observing her. About the only character who doesn't seem caught up in this is the Doctor himself. He insists that the whole planet is dead and that they don't have anything to worry about. It is possible, of course, that he's lying, that he feels it, but his curiosity is just overriding everything. Although I'm inclined to believe that he actually believes there is no danger. As I said, he does care about his granddaughter. And I think if he thought she was in actual danger, he would try to avoid putting her in more. The episode's atmosphere reaches its peak when they reach the city itself. The sound design really steps up at that point. The music, but also just the general sound design. There's a great echo effect as they walk through the city, makes everything feel metallic, and it makes the city feel very large and them feel very small. That sound, coupled with the shots of the cameras observing Barbara, make it clear that their fears about being watched are justified. Incidentally, I do know that the thing that is watching them in the forest and what's watching them in the city are two different things. But I'm talking about the general atmosphere, not the plot specifics. And once they're in the city, things get taken up a notch. Barbara's not just observed, she's maneuvered and almost herded like a prey animal, and she's eventually caught. Incidentally, Jacqueline Hill plays Barbara's growing level of panic fantastically. You can see her getting increasingly aware that what's going on around her is deliberate, not accidental, that she's not just getting lost, she's being maneuvered. And she knows it, and it's making her increasingly terrified. And this all culminates in her scream when she sees it. In addition to that great atmosphere, the plot of this episode has a lot of cool links to the show's past and future. The planet they're on is obviously one that's going to be very important to the history of the show, but we don't know that. At this point, this serial doesn't seem any more important than the serial that came before it, than the Caveman Adventure, with possibly the slight exception that this is the first time they've been off of Earth. But in retrospect, this planet and the species that lives there will be incredibly important. As I said, I'm pretty sure this serial is why the show still exists today. We also learn a little bit more about how the TARDIS works in this episode. Susan describes to, I think it's Barbara, that if you feed the TARDIS with the correct information about where you are, a big bank of computers can take over the ship and take you to wherever you want to go. This fits with what the Doctor said at the end of the last episode about not having enough information to fix their destination. However, it is hard to reconcile with how the Doctor will operate the TARDIS in the future of the show. Many times after this, we see the Doctor fix a destination without taking specific information from where they are. He just enters coordinates. But that's the Doctor later, after he's got centuries of exploration under his belt. At this point, he clearly doesn't really know what he's doing. His control over the ship comes gradually. Indeed, he's never going to be able to have any real control over it during the black and white era of the series. The sole real exception to that is the Daleks' master plan, and there are specific circumstances in that case. And even once he gets greater control, it's never perfect. He still always sometimes ends up where he doesn't want to be. But this doesn't change the fact that we know that what Susan is saying at this point about needing information about their current location to fix a destination is not strictly necessary. So then, in a larger sense, what do we make of their statements? Are they lying? Are they mistaken? Is it all part of the Doctor's bluff and bluster that Susan has bought into? I suspect it's a little bit of a combo. Like I said, Susan does say that the bank of computers can take over the ship and take it anywhere it wants to go. And she says this as if it's something she's witnessed. So I don't think she's out and out lying. I mean, the Doctor might lie to maintain the illusion that he knows what he's doing, but I don't think Susan would play along with that. I find myself wondering if what they're describing is sort of a backup navigation system for the TARDIS. A way you could sort of get where you want to go if you don't know the exact coordinates for where you want to go. And at this point, it's just the only method that the Doctor knows. If anything, I think this is just more early evidence that the Doctor stole the TARDIS. He doesn't even know how to control it properly. He only knows the backup system. There are a ton of little things I like in this episode. One of the things is that despite the fact that the radiation meter went off in the cliffhanger between the two episodes, it clearly stops functioning again. Otherwise, they would have walked back in and seen it. It's got a big flashing light, so either it started malfunctioning again, or they're blind. But I like that this was foreshadowed in the previous serial. The Doctor mentioned carrying his portable Geiger counter because he doesn't find that radiation meter reliable. And then, of course, his Geiger counter was broken, so now the unreliable radiation meter is the only one they have to work with. Other things. I like the shot of Ian's hair blowing in the forest as the branches around him stay still because they're petrified. I like the idea of that metal creature they found, that it's held together by an inner magnetic field, and the Doctor speculates that it could attract its victims towards it, assuming they were metal as well. I'm a little surprised that they never did anything with that creature, that it never showed up on the screen again, that we never saw a live version of it. Maybe it shows up in a book or a comic or an audio that I'm unaware of. There's certainly plenty of those. And I'm not surprised they don't make a big deal of it in this story, given who the big monsters of this story are. I'm just surprised that they never really seem to have come back to it. I also like that Terry Nation likes to play with the idea that the Doctor is wrong. He'll have the Doctor make a big pronouncement about something, and then something will immediately come and burst that bubble. Susan finds the city hot on the heels of the Doctor having declared the entire planet dead. He insists that she can't possibly have encountered anything in the forest. And then, of course, there's immediately that tapping on the outside of the TARDIS. And, of course, he insists that the city is safe. And it's not. Again, Hartnell plays his level of conviction the same whether he's right or wrong. And I think that's the right acting choice. For the record, I love the design of the Dalek City. It's like the cover of one of those 50s sci-fi magazines come to life. I think it looks absolutely gorgeous. Truth told, I love the entire design of this episode. I love the petrified forest. I know that it's just a studio set, but it seems very labyrinthine and alien. And of course, like I said, I love the city itself. Once we're in the city, there are a lot of little hints that it's designed for something other than humans. There's the metallic floors. There's the fact that the doors are just a little bit too low for humans. There's the metal plates for opening the doors as if they're designed for something sucker-shaped. I also like the use of all the Dutch angles when Barbara's being stalked through the city to emphasize how off-kilter everything feels for her. I also like the scene with the food machine. I do think they needed to establish that the TARDIS can provide the necessities of life. That it's not just transportation. This has been hinted at already. Susan was clearly living there while she was attending school on Earth. And we do get other things like Susan mentions telling Barbara where she can sleep. So it provides a place to sleep. It provides food. It's a place they can live. It's not just transportation. But the food machine also stresses the alienness of it all. It provides food they can eat. It apparently provides fairly nutritious food they could eat, but it doesn't provide normal food. I mean, it's all well and good that you can eat a little thing that tastes like bacon and eggs, but it's not actually bacon and eggs. It is probably healthier, though. One presumes that it doesn't bring all the grease and fat that come with bacon and eggs. I want one. I do wonder vaguely if Terry Nation was under the impression that he needed to establish the interior of the TARDIS because he thought there might be more episodes set entirely within it. Kind of like Star Trek would later do, where there are whole episodes that are set primarily on board the Enterprise. I do wonder if, this was early on in the series, so the format hadn't been entirely worked out yet, if they're occasionally thought there would be sort of bottle episodes where they encounter something in the TARDIS rather than going somewhere. Ironically, that would actually only happen, a handful of times throughout the entire series, although one of them is coming up pretty quick. Speaking of the food machine scene, I do rather like the little bit where Susan sort of elbows her grandfather to get him to offer them food because it hasn't occurred to him. As far as other things, I like that Ian is clearly security-minded, but he's not genre-savvy. He splits the party. Anybody who's played an RPG knows that's an incredibly dangerous thing to do. I also like that there are a couple of hints that the various members of the group are starting to suffer from radiation sickness. There's Barbara's headache. In particular, she mentions that she doesn't usually get them. And then, of course, by the time they get down to the city, they're all completely exhausted. They're having trouble speaking. They have to take deep breaths between their speaking. William Russell, playing Ian, does an especially good job with that. But they all, to an extent, are huffing and puffing and trying to get the words out in a way that's clearly difficult for them. This episode also has the first mention of the fault locator, a device for figuring out which part of the TARDIS goes wrong when it goes wrong, which happens a lot. I like this because it emphasizes how large and complex a machine the TARDIS is. It isn't like a car where the Doctor can just open it up and see what the problem is and fix it. It's got so many intricate parts that you need a whole device to tell you what's going wrong with it. The fault locator will also come up significantly in the next serial. Just as the previous one set up some things for this serial, this one is setting up some things for the next. I really like that these early serials sort of lay groundwork for each other. It has a greater sense of this being an ongoing narrative rather than each serial being entirely self-contained. Speaking of foreshadowing, the box of vials that they find is foreshadowing for later in this serial. We and they just haven't figured out what it is yet. And then, of course, there's that cliffhanger. I have liked the previous cliffhangers, but this is the first one that I would say is truly a classic one. There's Barbara's increasing panic, her dawning realization of what's going on, and of course that final scream as it closes in on her. Incidentally, I have always heard that the reason we don't see it is that the prop was not entirely finished yet, that they only had the sucker arm. I think that's kind of a fortunate happenstance because I think the cliffhanger as it is a bit of a classic. Don't get me wrong, I love its design, and I have for years, but I almost think it's better that you don't see what it is that Barbara sees at this point. That last shot is perfect. Well, those are my musings on the dead planet. Feel free to comment below. I always love to hear what other people have to say. Feel free to like, share, subscribe, all that good YouTube stuff. And I will be back for the next episode, because after that cliffhanger, we really need to know what happens next.